Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's special meeting. It is a study session of the City of Cupertino City Council. It's Wednesday, October 23rd. It is exactly 6 o'clock, and we are ready to start. Since it is a special meeting, we will be doing something slightly differently, but we'll go ahead with a roll call. Madam City Clerk.
Councilmember Chow.
Here.
Councilmember Moore.
Here.
Based upon medical advisement, Councilmember Way is not in attendance for tonight's meeting, and for the record is absent. Vice Mayor Fruin.
Here.
Mayor Mohan.
Here. Okay, we have one item in our study session today, but before we get into the meat of the discussion, let me just state what our purpose is. The purpose of today's study session is to provide more information to us, the City Council, and to the public regarding state housing laws that relate to residential development in the city. A few weeks ago, just to recap, our council asked staff to include this item as a future agenda item, and this study session is in response to council's request. It is also a response to the many emails that we have received about various potential housing developments in the city. I just want to make a couple of things clear. The City Council cannot lawfully discuss specific projects under this agenda item. If any specific project advances through the review process, public hearings will be held at the Planning Commission and then at the City Council at the appropriate time. But we are not there as yet. I want to reiterate that my intent in calling this meeting is to educate the Council and the public about these housing laws. We are all here to listen to an expert on housing laws, Ms. Barbara Kautz, and to understand what we can and what we cannot do. As you all know, housing and neighborhood issues are emotional issues for all of us who live in Cupertino, and we want to do our best for our city. But we also have to comply with housing laws, which keep changing almost every week. And I hope you understand. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Barbara Kautz.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor and council members, for asking me to be here. Let's see, I have a slide deck. I think the clerk's going to bring that up. I was asked to describe some major state housing laws that are related to what's been called the builder's remedy, since Cupertino has 4 active applications that are labeled builder's remedy projects. 2 have actually submitted project applications, and 2 have to do so by December or January. I am not going to discuss all state housing laws. The state's passed about 250 laws in the last 5-6 years, and none of us have enough time to discuss them all. So I'm going to discuss tonight just the ones that relate to the builder's remedy. So next slide. So I'm going to discuss 3 state laws that particularly affect the builder's remedy. One is, what is the builder's remedy itself? Secondly, the effect of what are called preliminary applications, or sometimes people call them SB 330 applications. Density bonus law also relates to this. I'm going to discuss the new state laws that are effective January 1st, 2025, and then lastly, the litigation that's occurred to date regarding the builder's remedy. There are not any appellate decisions that have been appellate published decisions. They're all trial court decisions. So it's hard to know what the courts of appeal will be. Next slide. So first of the builder's remedy, next slide. So the builder's remedy, as the law is written today, applies to affordable projects that are defined as projects for either 20% of the total units are affordable to lower income households, or all of the units are affordable to moderate income households. And generally these are proposed with 20% of the total units affordable to lower income households. The state has changed the AB 1893, which is one of the bills that will be effective January 1st, has lowered that affordability requirement to anywhere from 7% if all the affordable units are extremely low income to 13%. If a project has no more than 10 units, it doesn't have to have any affordable housing. So right now, for a project to be a builder's remedy project, it has to have 20% lower income households. And next slide. So if a project has 20% lower income households, in order for a city to deny the project, it has to make one of 5 findings. One of the findings is that the city has built all the units that are that have been allocated to the city in its housing element as a regional housing need assessment. Generally, it's called the RHNA numbers, and I believe in Cupertino that's several thousand. So I know no community that can meet this particular requirement. Or there has to be a specific adverse impact to health, public health, or safety based on an objective standard that was in place and that cannot be mitigated, or if the project doesn't comply with state or federal law, or if it's proposed on agricultural land, or the water or sewer is inadequate, or if it's inconsistent with both the zoning ordinance and the general plan land use designation. But if a project is proposed that's inconsistent with both the zoning ordinance and the city's general plan, the city can't make this finding unless it has a housing element that's in substantial compliance with state law. Also, the project can't be on a site designated in the housing element for lower or moderate income housing and consistent with the density in the housing element. So the effect of that is if a city has a housing element that's not compliant with state law, the city can't deny the project no matter how inconsistent the project is with the zoning and the general plan. So when developers believe that a city has a housing element that doesn't comply with state law, they've been applying for projects that don't comply with the local general plan and the zoning, and they argue that the project can't be denied because the city can't make any of the 5 findings. Even if the city believed it could make one of these findings, its findings have to be based on the preponderance of the evidence, and the burden of proof is on the city to demonstrate that its finding is supported by the preponderance of the evidence. In the past, there was something called, cities often, quote, self-certified their housing element. They adopted housing elements and said the housing element is consistent with state law because, one of the new laws, AB 1886, says that a housing element is not compliant with state law until the Department of Housing and Community Development approves the housing element, and also says that this is, quote, declaratory of existing law. Now, the courts may not agree that that's what the existing law is, but nonetheless, clearly the legislature intends that for a housing element to be considered in compliance, HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, must approve it. And that issue is currently being litigated. Next slide. So why are so many cities now having builder's remedy applications? This statute was enacted in 1982, over 40 years ago. But there's no published cases, although there's published cases about the Housing Accountability Act, there's no published cases on the builder's remedy. One reason is that many more cities did not have approved housing elements in this cycle, the cycle that goes from 2023 to 2031. The law changed a lot. HCD applied a much stricter standard to cities, and it was frankly hard to find competent consultants. Another reason is that it was publicized by a UC Davis professor who had started encouraging people to use the builder's remedy. And a third reason, if you can, next slide, was the effect of what are called preliminary applications. So next slide. So a preliminary application is like an abbreviated planning application. A developer can submit very sketchy plans, fill out a checklist, and so long as the preliminary application is filled out properly, it freezes development standards as of the date that the preliminary application was submitted. So that made it very easy for developers who believed that a city had an inadequate housing element to try to freeze in place the inadequate status of the housing element and therefore be eligible for a builder's remedy project. Now, even though the preliminary application freezes the development standards, it has to meet certain timelines. A developer has to make a regular application, a project application within 180 days, and also has to complete the application within 90 days of receiving an incomplete letter from the city. I have a note here that there's some disagreement about how that applies. The developer can change the project by up to 20% of the square footage or units, or invoke density bonus, which allows doubling of the number of units, and still rely on the initial preliminary application. So basically, by having this combination of housing elements that were many more housing elements had not yet been approved by HCD or hadn't even been adopted. So you had that on one hand, and the ease of freezing that inadequacy, if you want to call it that, in place has really encouraged developers to use the builder's remedy. Next slide. Some other key processing provisions. The formal project application is subject to the Permit Streamlining Act, the regular project application. Cities have to review it within 30 days, or it's, quote, deemed complete. And then once it's complete, the staff has to notify the applicant within 30 to 60 days if there's any inconsistencies with city standards. And if there's anything missed, the project is deemed consistent with those standards, even if it's not really inconsistent with those standards. Lastly, next slide. Now, if the project requires discretionary approval, it's still subject to review under the California Environmental Quality Act. And a lot of exemptions require general plan and zoning conformance. However, it's not clear if the general plan and zoning are applicable to a builder's remedy project. I think this is another area where there's probably going to be a fair amount of litigation about what kind of environmental review is required. But mitigation measures can be imposed so long as they are feasible. So the California Environmental Quality Act does give additional review of these projects, but it's not clear to what extent all the mitigation measures can be applied. So next slide. So I want to mention density bonuses here because many of the features of builder's remedy projects that people object to, like height, excessive height, lack of setbacks, and so forth, are things that developers can get under density bonus law without resorting to a builder's remedy project. Next slide. So to get a density bonus requires very little affordable housing. A project can get a density bonus with as little as 5% very low income housing. And once a project has that much affordable housing, which is not very much, they're entitled to receive a density bonus, which is anywhere from 20 of 20% to 100%. Certain 100% affordable projects have unlimited density. They can get anywhere from 1 to 5 in what are called incentives or concessions, those reduce costs. And they're entitled to an unlimited number of waivers of development standards. So they can ask for whatever height, setback, floor area, et cetera they want. They're also entitled to reduced parking requirements. And the statute says that a density bonus project is considered to be consistent with city standards, even if, of course, it isn't. Next slide. So how does that tie into the builder's remedy? Well, a builder's remedy project that has 20% affordable housing is clearly eligible for density bonus. So the only reason to use a builder's remedy project, a builder's remedy really, rather than density bonus, is if the density is more than twice that, is more than twice the maximum density that would otherwise be allowed, because under density bonus law, you can achieve twice the maximum density. Or if the density is less than the minimum density, the council may recall that state law required minimum densities of 20 units per acre on sites that the city was upzoning, and a builder's remedy project allows a developer to go below that. So, next slide. So the legislature has adopted pretty significant new builder's remedy legislation that will be effective January 1st. AB 1886, I believe I mentioned already, which says that approval by HCD is necessary to have an adequate housing element, HCD or a court, to have an adequate housing element. Next slide. And then the legislation creates a definition of a builder's remedy project under this new law. So it creates, the base density in Cupertino is the greatest of 45 units an acre, 3 times the maximum density. So if the maximum density is already 30 units an acre, the base density becomes 90 units an acre, or the density consistent with the housing element, whichever of those numbers is greatest, plus an additional 35 units an acre in high opportunity areas, and virtually all of Cupertino is in a high opportunity area. So developers are entitled to have a builder's remedy project that can get at least 80 units an acre in most of Cupertino, including in single-family areas. But none of the projects that you've received so far exceed or are even close to this density. But under density bonus law, that 80 units an acre can be doubled. Next slide. I mentioned that it reduces the required affordability to 7 to 13%. The city cannot apply its own BMR ordinance, which requires more affordability than 13%, unless it has a preponderance of the evidence to show that it won't make the project infeasible. It also provides 2 additional density bonus concessions. Next slide. It says that the objective standards that apply to the project, which of course the developer can ask to waive, but are those applicable to a district that allows the density and the type of building that's proposed. And if the city has no zoning district that allows that type of building and density, the developer can select the standards that apply. Builder's remedy projects are deemed to comply with city standards, and the developer can use SB 35, which is a type of ministerial approval that has no no review under the California Environmental Quality Act, if it complies with the standards that are picked. However, in Cupertino, an SB 35 project has to be 50% lower income, so it's actually fairly unlikely that somebody would use that provision. An interesting provision is that your 4 existing builder's remedy projects can elect either to apply under the old statute, or if they fit under the definition of a builder's remedy project, they could apply under the new statute. And they're entitled to make that choice. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there's been some builder's remedy litigation. It's all been in Southern California. Even the trial court decisions are all from Southern California, because in the SCAG area, which is the LA area and the surrounding areas, their housing elements were due over a year before those in the Bay Area, and as a consequence, everything, the litigation and everything is ahead. Next slide. To date, there's no appellate published decisions, so the trial court decisions are interesting, but they don't require other courts to follow them. They all involve the city as a defendant. The Attorney General has intervened in some of the cases, and HCD frequently submits declarations against the cities. Next slide. There have not been very many city successes in this litigation. So if there's an issue about whether the housing element is adequate or not, the trial courts have all agreed with HCD. If HCD has found the housing element to be inadequate, the trial courts at least have agreed with that. Some cities have said, well, we'll process your builder's remedy project, but you need to apply for a rezoning or a general plan amendment. The trial courts have said that's an effective denial of the project. They agree that the preliminary application freezes the status of the housing element. So if the housing element is inadequate when the preliminary application was filed, then even if it's adequate when a decision is made, the inadequate status is frozen. And without AB 1886, they've been split on whether HCD approval is needed for adequacy. Next slide. The state is very much interested in enforcing the housing laws against cities. I would say in every session of the legislature, they adopt harsher and harsher legal provisions. There's a HCD Housing Accountability Unit that has 25 staff that encourages developers to complain to them, and then often will send letters of technical advice to a city, meaning better do what we say. Here's our take on it. If the city doesn't follow their advice, they'll issue a notice of violation, refer the city to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General has its own 12-person strike force. Next slide. There's many active third-party litigants. The city was sued by the California Housing Defense Fund on its housing element, and they often join in, or they're the plaintiffs on project-related denials. Next slide. And then, what we've observed so far for the housing cases in general is that the courts tend to uphold housing, not always. They're generally pro-housing. They tend to uphold housing approvals and overturn denials. And if the city loses, it's required to pay attorney's fees. There was also some new legislation passed by Senator Wiener, or not passed by him, introduced by Senator Wiener, allowing fines of $10,000 to $50,000 a month if cities take action that's against public policy. So, next slide. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council might have.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, Barbara. Let's bring it back to the council, and if you have any questions for Ms. Couts, we can go ahead and ask. We can take 5 minutes each. So go ahead. I am not. Just give us a minute. Let's just stick to this. Councilmember Chow.
Hi, thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned the trial court has been split on whether HCD approval is required for housing element to be considered compliant. And so I wonder, has your law firm recommended your client to self-certify?
Well, I think when people
To
were
protect the city at the maximum.
Yes, we did recommend that people self-certify, because I think an argument can still be made that the housing element complies with state law. I had noticed that HCD has not, to my knowledge, approved any housing elements where people self-certified, and they've generally been sending long letters. To date, nobody's been. I mean, there haven't been very many cases, but to date, no city's been successful in having a court agree that the housing element was adequate when HCD has said it was inadequate.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that no cities have met the RHNA numbers from the last cycle?
No, from this cycle.
From this?
Yeah,
this cycle has just started.
Exactly. That's why nobody's met it. A number of cities met it in the last cycle.
Oh.
For instance, Beverly Hills RHNA was 3 units in the last cycle, and they didn't manage to build 3 units.
But do you have a number, what percentage of cities have met the RHNA numbers from the last cycle?
I don't, that's a good question. I don't know. Cities are not subject to SB 35 if they met their RHNA numbers. And I think there's about maybe 40 cities that are listed as not being subject to SB 35. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, most of them are smaller cities, but not all.
Yeah. So, I think there has been an understanding the state, even with the smaller RHNA allocation, has set numbers that's very hard to achieve.
Exactly.
And then with this current cycle, the number is 4 times more than the last cycle. So then they are setting an impossibility to achieve standard. So you mentioned that right now, Cupertino, SB 35 only applies if for projects that's 50 units or 50% or more that's below market rate.
Correct.
But when will the HCD reevaluate if SB 35 might apply even for 10%?
Yeah, so the reevaluation comes midway in the cycle, so it should be, let's see, the housing elements were due in 2023, so in 2027, I believe. So
if we did not have 50% of permits pulled by 2027, so after at that time, projects with 10% BMR could use SB 35 to have a streamlined process. No public or the city council can. Probably, depending on how much housing is constructed in the city, yes. Okay, thank you. I'll see if any. I reserve my time for the rest.
In one of your in your presentation, you talked about the density. We could either use the old statute. Cities could use the old statute or the new statute for density bonus. No, in terms of the builder's remedy, so the developers, the applicants for the 4 projects that are before this, that have active applications before the city, after January 1st, they can choose whether to use the new provisions or rely on the provisions that are in effect today. And the new provisions take effect in 2025? Yes, right? January 1st, 2025. Okay, and that is the one that's more favorable to the developers? I think for your developers, probably the ability to reduce the affordability might be attractive. That's true. I had one other question. You talked about high opportunity areas.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
So the Tax Credit Allocation Commission has a map that shows very high, moderate, low, and really very low opportunity areas, and it's based on things like, I don't know exactly how they do the maps, but school achievement, transportation opportunities, jobs, incomes probably, they have a variety of measurements that they look at, and then they have a fifth of the state is very high opportunity, a fifth is high, a fifth is moderate, a fifth is low, and then the low areas are areas of racial concentration and poverty. And when I looked at a map, it appeared that most or probably all of Cupertino is in a high or very high opportunity area, because you have good schools, you have relatively high incomes. I mean, it's a desirable place to live.
So this is a determination that HCD makes?
No, it's the Tax Credit Allocation Commission, which is the body that allocates tax credits. They have been trying to locate more affordable housing in high opportunity areas, and so I gather that's why the maps were done.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from council? Vice Mayor Fruin?
So I'm sure a number of people are probably wondering what precisely would constitute a specific adverse impact to public health and safety that would allow a city to deny a builder's remedy project.
I've thought about that. Possibly, remember, it has to be one that can't be mitigated too. So possibly, I mean, I've tried to think of it. Somebody who wants to have a well, and there's inadequate water, or the water's polluted, and there's no realistic way to correct the contamination. Possibly something with wildfire that can't be mitigated. Maybe inadequate evacuation routes. It has to be. There's language in the statute that says this finding shall be made rarely. Yeah.
Got it. And just to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, that is a finding that would have to be made by virtue of a preponderance of the evidence, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So some substantial evidence standard is not what would apply here. Something
Exactly.
much higher, a 50% plus one standard is what
Exactly.
would apply. Okay. So not only is there a very limited universe of things that could potentially apply, we have to prove it by a much higher standard.
Yes.
Okay. Something as typical of a normal development like traffic is not something that would ordinarily apply.
No, I mean, possibly if a driveway were located in such a location that, you could expect accidents, and there was no way to move the driveway, something like that perhaps, or, yeah.
Got it. But again,
yeah.
you'd have to prove it by a preponderance
So
of
the
the
evidence,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Also wanted to get clarity on just for the sake of the public, that when it comes to whether or not the builder's remedy would apply to a city, it is the lack of an adopted, substantially compliant housing element that is the trigger for the builder's remedy, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So merely submitting a draft does not turn off the builder's remedy, correct?
No,
Okay.
that's correct.
Very good. You noted that AB 1886 was intended to be declaratory of existing law. There is a standard that the courts follow for that. Looking through the legislative history, it certainly looks like the intention was to make it retrospective. So is there a particular reason that you think it wouldn't be?
Well, I think that the courts had already decided that HCD approval was not required. There's a number of cases where HCD found housing elements to be inconsistent with, not to comply with state law. And the court said, well, there's no presumption that just because HCD said so, that it was inconsistent with state law. We're doing this with our independent judgment. We make the law.
Mhm.
So I think, even though that was perhaps the intent, it's not clear that the courts would necessarily agree.
Yeah, Barb, just a clarifying question. Sorry.
Yeah.
That said, are there any instances where a court has disagreed with HCD on regarding its finding of whether a housing element complies with state law?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a couple of there are cases both where HCD found a housing element to comply and the court disagreed, and there's also cases where the HCD found the housing element not to comply and the court disagreed.
And how frequently does that happen?
Not very often. I mean, these are all, obviously they're not cases out of this year. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just in general, it sounds a little circular, though, for the court to say, oh, the legislature has gone and made this statement, but we think that because we already decided it this way that we're going to continue to view it as our prerogative.
Well, the issue is really whether the provision is retroactive or not. Clearly they will, after January 1st, it's pretty clear. But the issue is whether it's retroactive. We actually looked at a number of the cases, and in a number of the cases, courts have disagreed with a legislative statement that it was declaratory of existing law. I'm not selling this particularly because...
Yeah, I'm not trying to prejudice you with some future client here. I realize that that's an issue,
this really isn't an issue with Cupertino, but at some point, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Chow, you had a question?
Hi. So Cupertino, we have in a certain specific plan that require retail frontage along our major thoroughfare because we want the retail to be continuous. But then some SB 330 application have come in that do not comply with that. So are they allowed? If SB 330 is supposed to lock in existing standard says 75% retail frontage is required. Are they allowed to not follow that objective standard?
Yes, they're allowed to request a waiver for it under density bonus law. Not a waiver, sorry. They're allowed to request a concession for it under density bonus law. For the city to deny the concession, it would need to, in this particular case, it would need to show either that there was a impact on a historic structure, one of these specific health and safety impacts, or that it did not, that the city has substantial evidence that removing the retail would not
It's okay.
would not result in a reduction in
and-
costs. So, yeah.
And I heard that the California Constitution says the city has a right to recoup any loss on this state mandates. So these are state mandates that we will be losing revenue and we will be losing impact fees if people require it to be waived. So what's the city's ability under Constitution to be compensated for the loss in impact fees?
I mean, cities can make claims. I believe there's a mandate commission. There's some type of a process to make a claim that this is a state mandate and that the cities need to be reimbursed. But it's my understanding it's a pretty lengthy proceeding and very difficult to actually collect money.
Thank you.
Councilmember Moore?
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have a question regarding the slide on preliminary applications, the SB 330 applications. So for that one, you refer to the units, that they can change a project by up to 20% of square footage or the number of units. Is there anything in the law that talks about the size of those units?
Nope.
Okay. And then you also mentioned using density bonus, which allows the doubling of the units. So you could have a 3,000 square foot unit and then double that using density bonus laws.
Density bonus law allows doubling of the number of units, but it also allows this unlimited number of waivers of development standards. So that could, in effect, allow somebody to, get much larger units.
Okay, so an individual could have started with a preliminary application with the unit sizes being 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. They're going to double the units, and the new units they're going to use are going to be, we'll say, 4,000 square feet. Is that something that would be allowed?
I believe so, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's invite public comments now. And Madam City Clerk, how many cards do we have?
Yes, Mayor, I currently see one person requesting to speak virtually, and so far I see no requests to speak in Community Hall.
Okay.
Okay. So anyone wishing to request to speak on this item, please submit your card in the next 9 minutes or raise your hand on virtually in the next 9 minutes. So
Okay, did you say we already had someone on Zoom?
2 hands raised virtually now.
Maybe we can start with them. 3 minutes each, please.
Okay, so we have Sanar and Manuel Salazar. Welcome, San.
Good evening, Mayor Mohan and City Council members. Thank you for the informative presentation. I'd like to see if you might get further clarification on the matter of an incomplete application. I understand that the developer has 90 days to respond to an incomplete application. However, there's a comment that they can resubmit after that as per HCD. And my understanding was that based on some of the past projects, that application, if deemed incomplete after 90 days, could be marked as abandoned. I asked this specifically because I believe the incomplete application was returned to the developer before October 1st. And so 90 days would mean that would be before December 31st of this year. And so I would like to request the city to see if you can hold to the 90-day requirement and then declare the project abandoned, if not deemed complete within 90 days, and Jan 1st, 2025 is not yet here. So specifically, we do not want to see these projects be given extensions if that may be avoided as per the law. And we do not want to see these projects grandfathered into new and more lenient state laws beginning Jan 1st, 2025, particularly if they're incomplete within December 31st, 2024. So I request Council and City Attorney, along with any consultants you're working with, to please look at what leeway the city has to enforce the incomplete application deadline of 90 days. Further, I understand and appreciate the conversation around the aspects to which you can deny the project. I did not get information sufficiently on what constitutes a preponderance of evidence. So as we mentioned earlier today, the traffic through Faria is to the tune of 300 cars that have to go through in 15 minutes in order to achieve school drop-off. We'd like to get some specific data points around what constitutes that preponderance of evidence and on who does that evidence, who bears the burden of producing that evidence. Is it the city? Is it the residents of the neighborhood? Is it the school? Or what is that process going to be? And similarly for Vista Heights, as we are seeing right now, insurance is being canceled by insurance providers, even as close to Merriman Road, Santa Lucia Road, San Juan Road, Longdown Road. We've had several instances of insurance canceled, and these are not even deep into the hillside. We're still very much at the foothills here. So I'd like to request you to please take that into consideration and not permit the Vista Heights development to go through, given the insurance hazards and the fire hazards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Next we have Manuel Salazar, followed by Connie Cunningham. Welcome, Manuel.
Hi, good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi, my name is Manuel Salazar, and let me start off again. Good evening, Mayor Mahan and members of the Cupertino City Council. My name is Manuel Salazar, and I'm speaking up to you on behalf of SB at Home. We're an organization dedicated to advocating for affordable housing policies in your community and across all of Santa Clara County. So I'd like to begin by noting that we recognize the pressing concerns raised by residents regarding the recent housing development proposals and appreciate the opportunity to comment on these matters. As you know, the need for affordable housing in Cupertino is critical. Many community members have expressed apprehension about potential disruptions to the character of your neighborhoods and the impacts of increased density. We hear you and we totally understand. We hear these concerns and understand the complexities that accompany development in your rapidly changing environment. However, it is essential to clarify the projects submitted outside of the established housing element compliance follow a distinct process, as dictated by state law. While this legal framework may seem restrictive, it underscores the necessity for all parties involved to adhere to the rules designed to ensure compliance and transparency. It is the city's responsibility to provide the community with clear and detailed information with these processes and to actively listen to the concerns of its residents, which you have done so thus far. And I would really appreciate that. SBA Home stands firm in its belief that increasing housing opportunities is vital for the well-being of cities. And like many municipalities throughout the county, Cupertino faces dire needs for more housing opportunities, particularly for low and moderate income families. We commend the city's commitment to addressing these needs and urge you to continue fostering an inclusive dialogue with residents as these developments plans unfold. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Connie Cunningham, followed by Venkat Raghunathan. Welcome, Connie.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good evening. My name is Connie Cunningham. I'm on the Housing Commission, but speaking for myself only. I wanted to bring to the attention of everyone here that SB 330 has written within the law specific items that the cities can use to deny an SB 330 claim. One of those is specifically if it is surrounded on 3 sides by land being used for resource preservation. In this case, we have, in the case that I'm thinking of, Fremont Older Open Space Preserve to the south, Machete Ranch Open Space Preserve to the southeast, Stevens Creek County Park Reservoir to the east, and McClellan Ranch Preserve to the north, including Stevens Creek is a habitat itself for endangered species. This creek follows along the McClellan Ranch Preserve and along Deep Cliff Golf Course. Stevens Creek Reservoir is located upstream. Secondly, the property that I'm thinking of is unlikely to have adequate water or wastewater facilities. That is another point in the law specifically for which the SB 330 can be denied. In this particular case, they're asking to have 35 or so single-family units and a community sports center. And so clearly in this area where they're only intending 1 to 5 homes in the area, that likely does not have enough water or wastewater facilities. So that is 2 of the reasons, and I won't go any further because to me those are pretty obvious. But separately from that, those are within the law, just specifically to say they're within the law, and we can use them. And there is no reason to have to go through all of these other things that were so eloquently discussed in the presentation. I thank you for that. But additionally, any below market rate homes to be put in such an area, the fire hazard, who pays for the fire insurance for below market rate purchase rentals and purchase houses? Is it the city? Also, who pays for it if they're rentals? The city. And my point is that the city has more responsibilities to us citizens than just whether or not houses are built. There is more to the responsibilities of the city council to focus on preservation of the wilderness. Thank you for this time. Bye.
Thank you, Connie. And next we have Venkatasan Raghunathan. Welcome, Venkatasan.
Yeah. Hi. Good evening, City Council. and the manager and the officials there. I'm calling, I'm there to talk about a couple of items. One is both are basically co-located, the development of the RISE project and also the Wolf Road housing. I have been exchanging emails, and the RISE project has agreed that they wouldn't be breaching the wall. But I also had some questions on if there is a problem.
Excuse me. Can I interrupt you for just a second? I apologize. We are not discussing specific projects in this meeting today. So if you're referencing a specific project.
I sent an email. I sent a couple of mails on those, so that's why I am generally bringing it up on the breaching of the walls, and not to bring up the and not to do the breaching, because that will have impact on the noise and the safety of this neighborhood, because we have gone through a lot of issues during the development of the...
Okay, all right. Let me interrupt you again. Sorry about that. But maybe this discussion can be held at another time offline. Yeah, please feel free to contact us or the city manager's staff.
Yeah, we will do it. Yeah, we'll do it. I have been in contact already, but I just wanted to put it onto the record of the council. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we will move to those requesting to speak from within Community Hall. There are 6 requests to speak. We will begin with Jennifer Sharon, followed by Lisa Warren, followed by Govind Tadakari. Welcome, Jennifer.
Good evening, Mayor Mohan, City Council members and staff. I'm speaking tonight only as a resident of Cupertino. Thank you again for this session. It's been incredibly helpful, and I'm hoping there's lots of people watching online as well. I think I speak for the vast majority of residents that don't want builders' remedy projects in our city. Thank you very much to Vice Mayor Fruin for confirming that the builder's remedy for Cupertino, that window opened on January 31st, 2023, due to an uncertified housing element. Submitting the housing element doesn't close the builder's remedy window. I've heard a lot of chatter about that, and I think there's a lot of confusion, even by former planning commissioners. There's also talk about how the housing element no longer has a CEQA review after the lawsuit, but I believe the projects themselves still have to have the CEQA review. And if I'm wrong, I would love it if somebody would jump in and say, no, that's not the case, because again, this is the chatter I'm hearing that while that particular lawsuit made it that none of the projects, again, have to have CEQA review. So that just doesn't seem to fit right for what I know. Last, I want to say that I appreciate that staff will follow all the state and local laws. We've seen under previous council what happens if laws aren't followed, and we know what can happen now if we don't. The state is not messing around. However, I do encourage using the full extent of the law to determine if these projects do comply. Housing Commissioner Connie Cunningham makes some really good points, and I hope those will be considered. Thank you for considering my input tonight.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next we have Lisa Warren, followed by Govind Tadakari, followed by Steve Jacobs. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. So basically, in a nutshell, this is a hot mess. And most of the hot mess has been, I could say all of it probably, has been dictated by our state and the people who lead our state. So I'm just requesting that everyone who's voting considers that. I mean, every city's in trouble, but it's not every city's, let's say, fault. I know that's not the right term. We really need to start questioning and not just allowing certain lobbyists go up to the state and say what they want, because normally those lobbyists are absolutely against what residents want. So please vote wisely. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next we have Govind Tadakari, followed by Steve Jacobs, followed by Claudio Bono.
Good evening, Mayor Mohan and council members and city manager and attorney. The presentation was really good. but there are things which are difficult to understand. That is, in terms of builder's remedy provisions, I mean, of course, that gives a certain amount of leeway to the builder in terms of what density bonus, etc., they can avail. But the question is that if there's a structure put in a particular corner lot which impacts the neighborhood or the neighbor, what kind of clarification can we get from either from the HCD or from our external counsel in terms of what are the right? How can the neighbors exercise their rights? Because everybody's property has certain level of air rights, and if there's a blockage, say for example, if they are not getting the efficiency in terms of electrical, if they have put some solar panels and they are not getting the efficiency, what kind of things are built into the law, or what are the things which the neighbors can kind of appeal for? That's the question that I have. I couldn't get the answer to that question. Mostly it was about public health and safety, but not about the rights of the neighbors. So that's what I'm trying to understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Govind. Next we have Steve Jacobs, followed by Claudio Bono, followed by Luis Sedati. Welcome, Steve.
So I was just moved by Connie's statement that she made before talking about the environmental impact of one of the projects, or some of the projects, as potential ways that the council could look at a project and see if it meets all the requirements of the law. I would urge them to do that. Some of these projects have multiple projects coming into the same neighborhood, and I know that there's a tendency to look at projects individually, but when you have multiple projects, there's going to be kids who are going to be hit. There's going to be so much traffic that just cannot be prevented. I mean, it's just inevitable. You take small streets which feed into other small streets and which don't have any access to primary roads. And I'm not sure, as a community, we want to have to deal with this, 10 years down the road, we'll be sitting here and saying, well, the state forced us to do this. So I just leave you to thought. I think I speak for some of the residents that we urge this city council to do whatever you can and not just throw up your hands and say, well, this is the law and we're going to go away. I mean, I think that Connie said it best, much better than I could. There's several areas where the city can push back. It probably costs some money for the city to push back, but it's really not possible for the residents to push back. And we urge you to push back wherever you can, so that at least you say, we did what we could. So I just leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Next we have Claudio Bono, followed by Luis Sedati. Welcome, Claudio.
Good evening, Mayor Mohan, Vice Mayor Fruin, council members, City Manager Wu, City Attorney, and staff. Tonight, it is clear we can finally put all those rumors and falsehood to rest. The builder's remedy was the fault of not being able to govern our city, and we lost control. It's a result of voting no for years. Submitting a draft does not make you compliant, so blaming the council majority was false, a lie, and as I mentioned many times during this election year and while we're in election season, lying to voters is wrong. You lose power.
Claudio, I think just in fairness, I'd like you to try to keep your comments focused on state housing laws.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you, council majority, for holding everything accountable. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Next we have Luis Sedati. Welcome, Luis.
Sorry, I just have to increase my font size so that I won't squint quite so much. Yes, I see there are those of you on the dais that are smiling at me. Okay, so I'm here because I'm asking for transparency, okay? And I'm not a lawyer, and I just want things to be spelled out real clear, all right? So the state law, the presentation shows that the present council majority diligently worked to make and submit a housing element that was accepted and certified by HCD in September 2024, which closed the window for builder's remedy. So kudos to you, the present council majority and city staff, for a job well done. Kudos to you. You deserve a huge applause from throughout the city because you closed that builder's remedy per the presentation we got tonight. There are a large group of residents whose properties are affected by the adjoining builder's remedy projects near their properties. They're very upset and have been told by Better Cupertino members that the council majority purposely submitted their HE housing element 3 days after the deadline, blaming the present council majority for the builder's remedies and their property. This is for clarity according to the presentation. The presentation is to bring clarity and transparency. Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't want to argue with you, but I think everybody is trying to be civil here. And
I am.
Okay.
Aren't I?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think everybody's is really trying hard to keep focused on the subject matter of the meeting. So I'm just.
I am.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'm talking about housing element.
Okay.
Builder's remedy.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't want to argue with you. I just.
Okay.
I want to remind you.
The February 3rd, 2023 housing element submitted by the prior council was not sufficient, and it did not obtain HCD acceptance, and it was rejected. So it was the responsibility of the Better Cupertino Council that Cupertino was subject.
Excuse me, I'll have to
have one
interrupt
phrase.
you.
One phrase.
Yes, please, let's just, as the city attorney said, focus on the housing laws that we are talking about today and not
So I want to thank the present council majority for what they did to close the window on the builder's remedy, and following the presentation, that it was the previous council that was remiss. And I would urge all the residents in Cupertino to vote for the continuation of the council majority, not Better Cupertino, who failed having a housing element. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Mayor, no additional requests to speak on this item.
Okay. Okay, that ends the public comments section of the agenda. We can do one of two things, and I'm looking at council. There have been some questions raised by the public. If we could take a break, maybe address some of the questions that are pertinent to your presentation. If we could address that, we could do that first, or we can come back to council, make a few comments, and then do that. And that's your preference. What would you like to do? Mr. City Attorney?
We can take a short break and be prepared to answer a handful of questions if you want to do that now, and then if council has additional questions or comments, there would be time for that.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, let's
Can we do a 10-minute break?
Yes, a 10-minute break, please, and we'll come back in at 7:13. Thank you. Okay, so shall we proceed with the questions that were raised at today's meeting? Mr. City Attorney, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, so I'll do my best to address the questions that are, germane to what we are talking about today, and Barb is here to help if there's anything that needs to add. So we did get a question about what constitutes a preponderance of the evidence under the Housing Accountability Act, and who bears the burden of proof. The burden would be on the city that it's more likely than not to improve that an impact occurred if the city were to use that provision of the Housing Accountability Act to deny a project. As Barb mentioned in her presentation, there's language in the statute that indicates that the findings of a specific adverse impact on public health and safety are arising frequently. So those type of findings are disfavored, and the statute defines a specific adverse impact to mean a significant, quantifiable, direct, and unavoidable impact based on objective, identified, written public health or safety standards, policies, or conditions as they existed on the date of the application was deemed complete. So it is a narrow and specific definition in the statute. There was a question about whether a project can have an impact on solar panels. Generally, under California law, there is no general right to prevent a building on adjoining property from blocking light to solar panels. So that's not something that is a blanket right under California law unless you have a solar easement that guarantees that access. There was a question about whether builder's remedy projects need CEQA review. The answer is yes. They are projects under CEQA and subject to CEQA review. Again, subject to potential exemptions, and the applicable level of review would be determined on a project-by-project basis. And then there was a question about how to apply the 90-day provision in SB 330 that requires the submission of a complete full application in order to preserve the applicant's rights under SB 330. Certainly, I was listening to the comment, and I understand the sentiment. I don't think I can say very much about how the city is going to approach that situation because, Barb referred to that there is active litigation regarding this issue. But I certainly heard the comment, understand the sentiment, and I don't think I can say more about that in this forum. But certainly, I was listening. And I think those were the questions that we had identified. Obviously, if there are more questions that council wants answered, we would still have some time, and we will do our best to answer them.
Okay. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So do you anticipate, since we have an environmental assessment rather than a citywide programmatic EIR, that we would have projects attempting to tier off of the environmental assessment or attempt an infill exemption?
We do expect projects to attempt to use infill exemptions where they're appropriate. I think obviously it's hard to answer these questions in the abstract. I think the circumstances where you're tiering off of an EA prepared under state housing element law are relatively novel, and so. We have not had that request come in yet, to my knowledge, but we would certainly look at it if the request came in. I don't think there's clear law on how the EA provisions that we relied on to certify our housing element interact with the tiering requirements in CEQA.
Okay, and so what kind of a line is there where an infill exemption wouldn't be something a project would qualify for? What makes that not work? There
are 4 or 5 criteria. I'm not recalling them off the top of my head, but one of them is consistency with general plan and zoning standards.
Okay. What about if there was contamination on the site?
I don't think that would necessarily. Again, I don't recall all the standards off the top of my head, but a site with historic releases or other kinds of recognized environmental conditions, I don't think that would necessarily disqualify the use of an infill exemption.
Okay. And what if perhaps it had historical contamination and they end up needing to have an open case to remediate the site, and so there's no public review or discussion about the mitigations? Is that foreseeable?
I mean, I could certainly see that it's foreseeable that there is a CEQA exemption, and that case, there still would be entitlement process. If there's a public oversight process of the environmental cleanup, that process is also public.
How is that public? Would the city be holding hearings or some kind of?
I believe there's an opportunity to comment for regulatory agencies. Generally, they wouldn't hold hearings.
Okay. And what triggers that comment period, and how would the city inform the public that that comment period was happening?
It wouldn't be a city process. It would be whatever agency managed the process. So it would be Santa Clara County Department of Environmental Health, Regional Water Quality Control Board, DTSC. Okay. And so they would follow their public notice procedures, which probably have enough nuance and differences among them that I would get something wrong if I tried to answer them on the dais.
Okay, so from what I've noticed regarding that is I'm seeing some inconsistencies for when a project has like a 30-day notice period or not, even showing up on a site like GeoTracker. For instance, we do have a case that is similar to what I just described, which had no public notice period, whereas another city did have a 30-day notice period for their cleanup process for discussion. Okay. I'll save my minute there.
Councilmember Chow.
Okay. So if maybe first a question on the retail frontage. So we do have the retail frontage requirement of 75%, but then it's mentioned that the city, if there is any inconsistency to the city standard, the city needs to point it out in the 30-day notice, otherwise the project is deemed consistent. So whether or not they apply the concession for concession, isn't it a more, shouldn't the city still point out all the inconsistencies before the 30 days up?
So yes, I don't know what the city's practice is on that, but certainly you know, if the requirement is to identify the standard within 30 or 60 days, depending on the size of the project.
So the city should identify the inconsistency, and they can apply for concession later to be waived on that.
Yeah, and I don't know what planning's practice is, but certainly generally when applications come in, we do get requests for density bonus waivers and concessions, and we address them.
Okay. And then, and also, let's say, I think it's often that the law has different interpretation. There is conflict. The city interpret different from the project applicant, and maybe also from HCD. So if the city self-certifies and the developer disagree and would like to challenge that, would then they have to go to the court to challenge the city? Is that the process?
So the courts have taken, as Barb pointed out, the courts have taken the position that they exercise independent judgment in reviewing compliance with
I know
with housing element laws.
I mean, the process for the developers, they have to go to the court, which means it would add uncertainty for a project, and that it would likely then deter submission of builder's remedy project.
Well, perhaps, but it also adds a lot of legal risk to the city.
Okay, so
I just want to point out that, I mean, the biggest risk to the city in that case, which reduces the deterrence to the developer, is that the city would generally be responsible for paying the developer's attorney's fees in that case. Yes, but I'm clarifying that because it's an important point.
And then also that I think that for the question about the 90-day resubmission, so we understand it's an active litigation, but then it's again a case where the city could have a different interpretation. So it isn't that also better for the city to take a more conservative interpretation to protect the city. And then if developer wants to disagree, they have to challenge that in court.
So again, this is a disputed issue of law. The city will take a position on that when it needs to take a position, but that won't be tonight.
Okay. So another question is, we know that, as pointed out by Barbara Krauts, HCD has made it harder to the compliance standards harder. I think I have heard that some say they have interpreted the law differently sometimes than it's intended, or the cities disagree. Could you give any examples of disagreement between cities' interpretation and HCD's interpretation?
Well, one example that comes to mind, and we're getting a little far from the agenda item, is that HCD at one point had an interpretation regarding the tolling of the tolling of the limitations period for completing or vesting an SB 330 project during litigation. That interpretation was incorrect. So the city took the position that it was incorrect, but then that interpretation was subsequently corrected by subsequent legislation.
Thank you. Last question. Since the state has set impossible standards for the cities to reach by very large RHNA numbers, what rights the cities have on such predatory laws, which will likely allow almost all projects to become streamlined without any council approval or public input. So by 2027, that's likely going to happen. What rights the city have to challenge such impossible state law?
So generally, the city's options for challenging state law are limited. We're a general law city, so we are subject to state laws unless there's some constitutional or other reason why that makes them unenforceable. So
we have more rights if we were a charter city?
Yes, at least in theory, although I think the home rule doctrine can be kind of ephemeral. So I think that especially in the area of housing law.
Thank you so much.
I had a question about something I think one of the speakers said. What kind of neighborhood impact could lead to a denial, and is there? And how does a neighborhood exercise its rights?
I think that was the answer to one of the questions that was asked, and it's a fairly lengthy and narrow definition in the statute as to what impacts qualify for a denial. It has to be a specific policy or standard or something else that you're violating, and it also has to be an impact that can't be mitigated. So it's a very narrow standard. As far as the neighbor's rights, the process that before the council protects the due process rights, which are associated with the property, right? But the neighbors would have the opportunity to participate in that process, and the council is at least at the administrative level the final decision maker in that process. If the neighbors are unhappy with that process, after a council decision, they would be able to challenge that in court. Before that council decision, there really aren't realistic pathways to challenge that in court because of the exhaustion doctrine.
And the council is pretty limited to denying it on those five different.
Well, yes, a lot of what the presentation you heard tonight was about the limits that state law imposes on what the council can and cannot lawfully do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Sure. I'm wondering about the specific impacts issue. So would a cancer risk or an exceedance of a Bay Area Air Quality Management District standard for air quality? Would that be something that would count, or noise limits? Are any of those specific enough to make a difference?
So I could certainly see situations where a quantifiable sort of pre-existing health impact would meet sort of the initial threshold, but you still have to answer the question of whether that impact can be mitigated or not.
Okay. So in the going back a few years, for instance, we had the Valco specific plan, which said with mitigations, the air quality during operation, during construction and at operation would exceed Bay Area Air Quality Management District standards. So that could not be mitigated. And there were also noise impacts which could not be mitigated for that particular project. And I understand that now with the SB 35 project, there was no environmental impact report. However, when we look at the size of that project and you layer on over it all of the others, so you've got another 3,000 units on top of that, we can logically conclude that we are going to exceed the air quality and noise standards if we are to build this all out within our own city, and that's not even considering the cities around us. So my concern is that we're by having that particular lawsuit from YIMBY Law, having us the stipulation that we would bypass CEQA with I think it's 65759, the government code that they used for that. And interestingly, there is another publication from Davis Law that came out in January of this year regarding regarding that law that they used, and that there were parts that needed to be litigated, including the tiering off of environmental assessment issue, and then another aspect with regards to zoning. So my concern is that if you have, say, 50 projects come in and they're going to try an infill exemption, that those 50 projects together should not be bypassing the California Environmental Quality Act, or even this number of separate projects here, that we're kind of blocking out our entire environment. What we should have is an environmental impact report, and we're looking at these little individual projects, which will be more difficult to say that they're having significant unavoidable impacts, because you're looking at a 30 unit project versus the whole of the city's housing element. I hope you can follow that, but
I think I can follow that. I mean, there are exceptions to the categorical exemptions in CEQA that, I mean, again, this is very hypothetical, but in some situations could apply, although those are also applied rarely. I guess I would also say, and this is more of a policy point, is I think part of the theory behind the infill exemption is that by encouraging infill development in already developed areas, overall you're reducing the environmental impact if the alternative is development in greenfield sites that are more dispersed from urban centers.
However, that's generally when you've got a city which has a housing element and a general plan with an environmental impact report, and the public is all aware of the impacts to their air quality and noise because it's all been laid out there for them, including the cancer risks as well. And so, all along with this process, I've been gravely concerned about this bypassing CEQA issue, because the city doesn't know what the entire impacts are going to be. We also don't know the impacts for public safety. I would assume that the police and fire impacts, I would assume that would be something that would be important for the approval process, but we don't know what those impacts are as well. Right. So I feel like we're really being kept in the dark in a way that's not healthy for us moving forward.
Right. Yeah. So police and fire impacts are generally only considered under CEQA if there's a construction of a new facility that would have an environmental impact.
And we would likely need another facility. Same with the sewer too. Having 6,000 units, we're very likely going to need another sewage treatment plant. All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Chow, you had another question?
My
we'll
time
go
is
with 1
up,
minute.
so can I? So there are many new state laws that have passed this year, and we have not had time to cover that. Specifically, I think AB 2243 about that would impact regional malls and some sites near freeways for those that's impacted by AB 2011. I wonder what's the impact on Cupertino for that one?
I'm not prepared to speak to that tonight. I think that's certainly something I could follow up with the council.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Another one is about the Mitigation Act that imposed standards on transportation fee for housing development within half mile of major transit. And
Yeah,
if we
and
can
again,
have more
I'd be
detail on that,
happy to
that would
provide.
be great.
I mean, I think that council has some information on that, but I could provide more detail.
Another concern I think many people had was there was a revision of the SB5 provision. So could you speak briefly about that? I think you probably have more information.
The
on
revision of the SB5.
SB9, sorry. SB9.
Yes. So there are changes to SB9. SB 450 will take effect on January 1. There will be some impacts on what we refer to as SB9 projects, including a requirement for expedited review. There's a 60-day review period, much like the current process for ADUs. And there are also some tightening of requirements for objective standards that apply to those projects. So I think that the SB9 ordinance that the council adopted in 2021, I believe, I think will, for the most part, in the most substantial ways, will be consistent with the new statute. The planning division is looking at our existing ordinance to determine if there are updates that we need to make sure that we will continue to be compliant and have a fully enforceable ordinance.
Yeah, and then multiple, I think, state bills also expanded the range of projects that will qualify for ministerial approval without council or any public input. So if you could maybe provide the summary on.
Yeah, I think you've touched on some of those already, but I can provide I can provide additional information.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Moore. 1 minute, please.
Thank you. Just one point of clarification. There were a couple of members of the public who were trying to assess blame for the housing element being approved in September of 2024. When I flip through this presentation, I don't see that information. Could you clarify? Did I miss something in here?
So I think I think the best way for me to respond to that is to say that the housing element process is not that the city went through is not on the agenda this evening, and so the presentation reflected that. And I think and I appreciate the council and the members of the public that have been very respectful of those limits and have really tried to keep this process educational and informative, which was our goal.
Thank you.
Councilmember Chow, last comment.
So I did ask some questions regarding the housing element, which is not on agenda today. So there were no answers for them. Would we expect answers later?
I can go back and look at those comments. I'm not sure what role my office has in sort of relitigating what happened during the housing element process.
It's a lot of questions people have.
I understand that. But I'm struggling to find an appropriate role for the city attorney's office to resolve those questions.
So an info memo, because most of my questions are people have asked me. So, and then I thought it would be best if the city staff can provide answers, and your office can decide that. Okay. Yeah, respect your okay.
Vice Mayor Fruin.
So I might have to drag Barb Couts back up here. but we'll see upon asking the questions. The first was to clarify with respect to eligibility under SB 35. That functions at sort of two speeds, right? One where you're subject to 50% affordability standards, another to 10 or 15 if you have a higher inclusionary ordinance locally. But that 50% threshold, you're never really going to leave unless you're not producing your above moderate income requirements, right? Your market rate of housing.
The 50% will go away, you have to be, by the midterm of the midpoint of the cycle, which will be 2027, the city would have to issue building permits for half of the above moderate income units in its RHNA. I'm not sure what that number is. Maybe the staff knows, but yeah. You have to actually issue the building permits.
Yeah. But our pro rata share by that point in the cycle,
half,
and only for that income category.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or at least anyway, as long as we continue to have a certified housing element per SB 423, I think if you lose your certification, you're subject to the light version too.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, AB 1893 is lengthy and a little confusing. And I know that at least in talking to planners in San Jose, where I think they had some hope that maybe it would give a little extra guidance on how to process these applications, that they were left wanting. So, one of the questions that I certainly have is if you have a builder's remedy application that has lapsed before the 1st of January of next year, does AB 1893 resuscitate it?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
There is language, as you say, it's a very confusing statute, and there's language where you're not quite sure what the purpose was, but they have not changed any of the provisions about the applications lapsing.
Mm-hmm.
So our interpretation would be that they still lapse.
Got it.
That it has to be a viable. It has to still be an alive preliminary application to use 1893.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then earlier on in your discussion, you mentioned, cities that had chosen to self-certify, or at least adopt without having gotten a say-so from state HCD. San Jose was one of those cities. There were 15 builder's remedy applications that were submitted prior to adoption. There were also 15 builder's remedy applications that were submitted afterward.
Uh-huh.
And that has been a story in just about every city that has tried to self-certify, that they've continued to get these applications. So I guess the question there is, does that really help anything?
Oh, have the builder's remedy applications solved the housing crisis?
No. Has that as far as I can tell, none of them have ever been approved. So presumably not, because there's not a single project that's been
self-certification, did it help anything? I mean, I think it would give cities did it because they felt it would give them an argument that their housing element was adequate.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, in the trial courts, and again, there aren't very many cases, they haven't been very successful.
Yeah.
So I'm not aware of I'm not aware of an instance where self-certifying has been helpful.
Yeah.
I guess I would say that.
And even if one, managed to get certification, say, close to January the 31st of last year, there's a deadline to get your rezonings done that you also have to follow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's correct. So a number of cities had HCD-approved housing elements, but had not. But because HCD approved them more than 120 days after the deadline, then they were required to adopt the zoning by January of 2024 and hadn't done so, and so their housing elements were still not considered to be consistent with state law.
Yeah. Or indeed, you could wind up in a strange situation like Portola Valley and wind up being revoked.
Yes, that was unusual because they're supposed to give notice before revoking, but they did not to Portola Valley. I'm not quite sure what the status is now.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, the last that I saw, they had a study session where they were considering disincorporation. So I don't know. But thank you.
Thank you. And Councilmember Chow, you still had one more question?
Since we
This will
have
be the
Barbara
last one.
Kraus here, I hope to ask one more question. So we have now adopted the housing element. The HCD has certified it to be compliant. But in case we want to make any adjustment on the housing element site, perhaps adding some, deleting some, upzoning some, at the same time downzoning some, what kind of process it would be? And
well, there is a restriction on downzoning any sites unless the city at the same meeting upzones the site to create the same amount of capacity as is lost by downzoning a site. It is possible. I do have one client that wants to change a housing element site, and it is possible to do that. I mean, the process would be to submit the proposed change to HCD and see if they agree. Then if they agree, then the council could adopt the change, although we would suggest that whatever change the council makes not go into effect until HCD actually approves the change.
Yeah, so, but until HCD approval, we still have a compliant
yes,
housing
then you would
element
still have
that,
yes.
So
what you want to
until-
make sure is that there's no gap between
but as long as
adoption
we do
and
that,
certification.
we can make
Yes.
change.
Yes, it is possible to do that.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Has there been any precedent for that?
Well, as I said, I have one client who had a very small arena and designated one site and wants to change the site. So we'll see what happens with them.
So, Barb, just one follow-up question.
Yeah.
So what would happen if a property owner submitted a preliminary application while that change was pending, either before council or HCD?
Well, I think until the council changes the housing element, then that's why I was suggesting that if the council adopts a resolution to change the housing element, that it not become effective until HCD had actually approved the change. That's the only, because otherwise you could have this problem of having a gap, correct?
Right.
Where you've adopted an amendment to the housing element, but HCD has not yet approved it. So you would try to avoid that. That's the only way, that's the risk.
But even if you avoid that risk, you still have an issue with vesting before, if you could, the SB, the preliminary application, the rights under the current zoning could vest before.
Yes, yes, that could be an issue. Yes, if the city was interested in downzoning a property, yes, anytime before the council actually adopted the ordinance, someone could submit a preliminary application to maintain that existing zoning. That's correct.
Vice Mayor Fruin.
And then, just for the sake of clarity, we would require HCD approval of that change, yes?
Yes, I don't think you would take any action until they told you in advance it was okay.
And they would go through a process to analyze whether or not that change is valid under housing element law, including things like affirmatively furthering fair housing standards. Okay, so if a site is specifically chosen because it helps us to satisfy AB 686 and it's affirmatively furthering fair housing standards, that might pose a specific problem then.
That might, well, if, oh, you mean if it was taken out?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. To the city attorney, I note that we had a few different questions about, CEQA, the applicability of our settlement, on how environmental review will work, and also sort of how a builder's remedy project might be processed. Is that a memo that you think that you could produce for us?
Yes, I think that's a memo I could provide to council.
Okay, that would be great. I don't think I have anything else. Thank you.
Okay, since I'm not seeing any other questions, I want to end here. Thank you very much, Barbara Kautz, for showing up today. It's a long way for you to come. It was very helpful, so thank you very much. So this meeting is now adjourned.